Hi everyone! My name is Sarah Kelly, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about a lesson plan that I made, and I'm particularly going to go over one specific activity, some learning objectives that are correlated with that activity, and ways that you can assess learning. So this is actually tied to my graduate research project, and I wanted to start by just giving you an overview of what that is. So I'm working on the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest Discovery Trail, and currently they've already developed a field trip for students of middle school and high school age, and so they are in the concrete operational and the formal operational stages of development. So they told me that they've done a couple pilot tests already on the current Discovery Trail, and they told me that they had some issues with the tree identification portion of the trail. So I thought that it would be a good idea to try to give them some suggestions for what they can do. So I targeted my whole activity around tree identification, and the lesson itself came with several different activities, two of which I completely laid out in my written version of the lesson plan. But today I'm just gonna be talking about one activity, and here I just brought a tablet into the screen. So the Discovery Trail that we're doing on the H.J. Andrews Forest is actually all done through iPads. This is a different tablet that I'll be using today, but the students on the trail will be using iPads, and the reason being is the teachers will be able to eventually completely do the trail in a self-guided way. So we don't have a whole lot of resources to actually have people out on the trail because it's a research forest, and we don't always have people there who can give guides or tours. So we decided to do everything on iPads, and I know some people might be a little bit worried about that. People are in nature, they shouldn't be using technology, but it actually allows us to really design the program very well and make sure that the students are getting specific information. So what I've done today is I've actually made an activity that would require a field guide, but currently in this stage of the Discovery Trail, what we're doing is we have field guides out there with the iPads, and then eventually we will completely transition over it to being completely self-guided. So let me just get started and tell you about what activity that I did and the learning objectives and everything. So obviously you're not going to be able to read all of this, but I did want you to get a sense for the flow of what the students would be doing out in the field. So the two objectives that I have here that are bolded are identifying several types of tree species in the Andrews Forest, and currently they're trying to identify 4 on the current iteration that they've already developed, and then recognize the characteristics of different types of tree species. The other 2 objectives under that are connected to another activity. So the assessment of learning evidence for those 2 objectives would be to identify 4 trees in the forest, and this would be after they receive some instruction both from the field guide and through the iPad. And then the field guide would lead them to another part of the trail on another stop where they would see new trees that they're the same species but a different one, maybe a different size, a different age, and they would have the students, each student, identify one of the trees and explain what characteristics led them to think that it was that particular tree. And then some activities that we have for after the trail could be that the students pick a whole new tree, one that they didn't learn at the Andrews, and they would have to go and do some research on their own and take pictures of it and do kind of a show and tell in class and say which tree they had and how they figured out which tree it was. So that's something that you can bring back to the classroom, and really the great thing about using the iPad is this could easily translate into another environment as well. So the activity is called Honing Your Tree ID Skills, Trees of the Western Cascades, and the thing about tree identification that's really great is that if you look at a forest and you don't see diversity, if all the trees look the same, if all the plants look the same, maybe some of the small mammals look very similar, you can't really appreciate the diversity that's there, and you don't maybe understand the complexity or the structure of the forest. But once you can start to identify things, then you can begin to appreciate it more. You can know how old, even without measuring it, you can get a guess for how old it is after you know more about a particular tree. You might be able to tell how it changes over the season, and so you get to get this kind of intimacy with the tree that you wouldn't have if you didn't know that it was the same tree and it was changing over time. So there's a lot of great reasons for why we can start exploration in the forest by doing tree identification. So this would be one thing that the students would see. So name that tree. During this time, the field guide will point out 4 common trees in the Western Cascades forest ecosystem. These include western red cedar, western hemlock, Douglas fir, and big leaf maple. So the field guide at this point would go to different trees and say, this is what this is what this is, and they wouldn't necessarily say anything about the differences between them. At this point, the field guide would ask the students, what do you think? What differences do you see between the trees, and what would help you tell them apart? And so they'll get a chance to brainstorm on their own before they actually go through a dichotomous key and a video that will identify all 4 of these trees. Now, for today's demo, I've only done one for the western red cedar and the western hemlock. So how can we identify trees? Many naturalists use dichotomous keys, and these keys give you a set of questions that lead you through the process of tree identification. So let's try it for this tree. So again, this is backwards, but it's a tree, so it should be easy to tell what it is. So we have some cones here, the leaf structure, the full tree, and the bark. And at this point, they would have already heard what tree this is by seeing an example in the forest, but we wouldn't be naming what the tree is at this point. Some of them may already be able to match it just by seeing the pictures and seeing what's in front of them, but we're going to take them through a full process of using the dichotomous key. So, many naturalists and scientists use dichotomous keys. These keys give you a set of questions. This is the same prompt that was in the previous slide. It's on all the next few slides. So, it asks you a prompt. Is this a tree? Is this tree a conifer or a broadleaf? And then it has a description of what a conifer is and what a broadleaf is. So when they're in the field, they'd actually be able to click each one. It would take you through until the end and tell you what the tree is. Since this is through a PowerPoint today, it already has all the answers preloaded. And all of this was taken from OregonState.edu/trees, where they have their own example dichotomous key, and I worked through the same process that they had online. So it's a conifer. You can see that green circle. All right, the tree is a conifer. So are the leaves like needles, or are the leaves flattened and scale-like? And if we remember from the pictures, the leaves were flattened and scale-like. All right, so now it's circled. And we'll move on. Leaves flattened and scale-like. Are the leaves short and sharp, or are some leaves not sharp? And what we know about the picture that we saw is that the needles or the leaves were rounded. So they were not sharp. So now that's circled. So some leaves are not sharp. So are the cones round, or are they not round? And if we remember from the picture, they were kind of oval shaped and had an opening at the end. So we'll select that the cones are not round. And now it's circled. All right, so the cones aren't round, and looks like I left one slide off there, if that's okay. So the cones are like rosebuds because they open up, and the other option we had is like a duckbill. So now we've gone through the whole dichotomous key, and we go to the next slide and we find out it's a western red cedar. So this is just one way to identify a tree, but likely the students at this point would say, well, wait a second, we're in an old growth forest and we can't see all of these things. We can't see the leaves, we can't see the cones. Now there will be some species that are smaller because it's not all an even age stand where they would be, but many of the trees would be old growth or second growth, and they likely would only be able to see the bark. So we go through another option, and this is a western hemlock, and it's a video, so it goes through a lot of the same descriptions that we did with the western red cedar, but it's an actual narrated video. It's about 46 seconds. I'm not going to play that now. And then after they go through all 4 identifications for the 4 trees that we selected, then the students are gonna split up into groups of 3, and they'll pick one of the 4 trees and go find it in the forest and then say what it is and why that's what it is. So they would use the same characteristics. And I would also encourage including in the iPad slides more specific pictures of the bark, of each of the barks, and a really good description of how to identify those 4 trees just based on the bark alone. So after each group has identified their tree, then they'll share with the whole group which tree they had and back up their claim that that is the actual tree that it is, saying like what the different characteristics of the bark are, or if they can see the leaves, similar to what we went through in the dichotomous key. So the final test, and this goes back to the assessment of evidence at the beginning, would be that the field guide would pick, they would go to a different stop. So they'd be at one stop where they had been really familiar with a couple trees, and they probably would go back to the same tree because they knew exactly what it looked like. And then we'd go in a whole new stop, and the field instructor would pick maybe a same tree but of a different age, and pick one tree for each student of the 4 that they already identified. And each student would have to say what that tree is and why, using the same characteristics that we already went through in the activity. And the note for teachers is that this lesson includes 7 total learning objectives, and the other objectives are included in the other activities and assessments. And all of the objectives could be used for concrete operational stage or higher, but I actually added 3 additional optional objectives for those in the formal operational stage, because we do have some high school groups coming out, and those would have more argument analysis and doing some argumentation about diversity and why diversity is good in the forest and in the social world. And the other activity that we have, which comes before the tree ID activity, is actually a product ID activity, because some people may be a little overwhelmed by trying to identify a tree, but when they realize that they use identification skills every day by identifying different types of food and different products, they may feel more comfortable doing the second activity. So that's just a quick summary of the whole lesson plan, and I want to thank you for coming to the H.J. Andrews Forest Discovery Trail.